Hey everyone, welcome back to Office Hours. I'm Julian Zelizer of The Long View, and this is our weekly get together where you can ask me whatever is on your mind, historical and otherwise. I hope some of you had a chance to take a look at my column in Foreign Policy today, which I posted in the notes. It's about when President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act in 1992 in Los Angeles. It's the story of Rodney King and the urban unrest that followed. But it's really about kind of how much it took for President Bush, like the handful of other presidents who have invoked the Insurrection Act, which gives the president broad authority to impose federal policing essentially at the local level, and how unusual it is the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing from the administration right now. So I hope you enjoy the piece. It's up online as we speak, and you can find it right on the homepage. Tomorrow, I have my column coming out for The Long View, which continues to explore what we're seeing with ICE in Minneapolis. And I look forward to your comments on that and some terrific guests this coming week on Friday, in addition to John Alter for then and now. I'm going to be speaking with Duncan Hosey, a legal scholar at Stanford, about a recent piece he's written, and then a historian at the University of Michigan, Heather, who wrote a fantastic book, Heather Ann Thompson, who wrote a terrific book on the Bernard Goetz shooting in 1984 in New York. And she recovers the history and what it says about the politics of white rage, and obviously origins of where we are today. Really, I thought it was a fascinating book and a great read. So I'm looking forward to talking to her here on The Long View. All the dates and everything will be on the newsletter tomorrow. And I will also do in the classroom for paid subscribers. And I think I might start a little later just because of some commuting. But that's where everything is. So please send in your questions about whatever you are thinking about in the news. Obviously, the reason I wrote in Foreign Policy about the Insurrection Act is there has been renewed conversation about it. This is something that President Trump has spoken about in the past. He said that he would invoke it during the campaign. I think it was last week. I don't have the exact date in front of me. Steve Bannon, the architect, one of them of MAGA, said in response to Minneapolis that the president should invoke this. And so it's there on the table, and he has been reluctant. The administration has not done it, which I don't think we should take lightly. We don't know why and kind of what are the guardrails holding him back. But the idea is it would be justified based on a crisis and the need to protect federal agents. So it is an act, I think we've talked about it here before, which hasn't actually been invoked very frequently. President Trump says it has, but it hasn't. It's really something. It's from the 19th century. We saw it during the civil rights era in a couple of instances with Little Rock and with the University of Mississippi in 1962, Little Rock in 1957, and then in Detroit with the urban unrest that followed a case of police harassment in that city and in other cities. In each case, it's really remarkable when you read the archives, and in the article I quote a document, a memo that Nicholas Katzenbach, the deputy attorney general, wrote in 1964. Even in that case, where certainly in the Jim Crow South, you literally had law enforcement and state officials who were cooperative, if not part of the KKK, who were violating federal law, who were refusing to implement new programs. In that case, when presidents finally and very reluctantly, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson sent in troops. It was with a great reluctance, but that was the situation in 67. He has their request coming from the state government, as was the case with President Bush. in 1992. Both the mayor, a Democrat, and the governor, a Republican. So the way it's being discussed right now is quite remarkable, and that's really interesting. So Lynn asks, why is the news about what happened in Oregon receiving less attention than what happened in Minnesota? I don't have a clear answer to that. Obviously, there is a history in Minnesota because of George Floyd. It was arguably one of the most contentious points of protest in 2020 in the summer after Floyd was tragically killed by the police. And so part of it is that history I think the media tends to build on as opposed to Oregon. Second, I do think, what we learn about social movements is even once it ends, the infrastructure doesn't disappear. It's not unlike a party organization. So I think what you've seen, and it's not that Portland, Oregon doesn't have very kind of robust activism, but I think in Minneapolis, it really reached a pretty sophisticated level after George Floyd, given the anger that existed. And so I think that kicked in pretty quickly from memory and also from organization. And I think part of what Minnesota has been very effective at in Minneapolis is what civil rights activists in the 60s always focused on, kind of getting the media to shine a light on the realities of what was happening on the ground. And there was some coverage of Oregon, but I agree. So I think that's it's just a second factor. It's just part of the overall infrastructure there and familiarity with what activists need to do to expose what abuses of power are taking place. And finally, and I would be remiss. I do think in our current media age, there is a randomness. I mean, there's always a randomness. It was in the civil rights era. Why did the national media focus on one state and not the other? And some of it was driven by where the movement invested its resources. Part of it was just reporters, putting their attention in one place as opposed to another. So I think that's a third a reason why you're seeing this. I'm trying to read an inquiry into the conditions of right. Well, I think yes, Janice. I think those images. It's interesting. I have kind of gone back and forth. There's part of me that is more skeptical of the power of the images in our current age. So the iconic image from Birmingham, Alabama in May of '63, which many of the older people, uh, such as myself, on the Substack, would remember was the image of the police hosing down and sending police dogs on young nonviolent protesters had such an impact. Richard Goodwin, Lyndon Johnson, speechwriter, writes, and Kennedy, also speechwriter, writes about this in his memoir, seeing it on television and remembering how it just changed the tenor of the politics, as did the march in Selma, which led to the violent confrontation. And I go back and forth. There's part of me that does see how these images, such as the 11-year-old child and such as obviously the shootings that we have seen and the other images that are coming out, still are moving the public. On the other hand, it is more challenging today. Back in '63 or '65, as an example, back in '63 and '65, you had a unified media, you had three networks, handful of newspapers, and the power of disinformation was just much weaker. It was on the fringes, but not in the mainstream. And today we live in a very different kind of political culture. And we also have a president more willing to explicitly, with the administration, try to contradict what you see with your own eyes. It's not what Kennedy did in '63 with Birmingham. He responded to what was happening. There were debates about how to respond, but he didn't deny the reality that was front and center. And then similarly in 1965 in Selma, Lyndon Johnson responded affirmatively. And now we have a situation where you saw the administration has tried to kind of recraft what you see. Michael asks a very important question, and it's actually part of this focus of my newsletter tomorrow. Can DHS, can ICE be reformed? And I think that's really at the heart of what some of this debate has to be about. I mean, there's part of the debate which obviously focuses on the officers on the ground and their tactics and how they're operating. Part of it focuses on the Trump administration and the broader deportation policy. But part of it has to look, and Ben Rhodes had a piece in the New York Times at how ICE works, how DHS works. This is a post 9/11 structure. We had a major reorganization of government after 9/11, one of the biggest really in decades. And part of what it did is it moved immigration enforcement outside of DOJ, much freer from the constraints of the rule of law, and militarized the operation. And this is just one element where I think you're hearing more voices asking kind of, why does DHS work this way, and how can we reform it? The idea of reforming it during the current administration, I think, is very low. There's very little interest in, or no interest in doing this, because ultimately a reform of DHS will be seen as rightly critical of how the administration has deployed it. But I think that's a big reform agenda. And yes, it can be reformed. It is not something we've had even in the 1990s. So we didn't even have it at the start of President Bush's presidency. And those reorganizations, and there's more that aren't just related to Minneapolis, I think have to be on the table, and they don't have to be a campaign theme. But I do think if Democrats, for example, you know, take power ultimately, this will be, along with things like the Insurrection Act, a long-term issue that need to be discussed. And yes, the kind of movement of border officials, this happened in Chicago already, into downtown areas. I don't think it's simply border control agents being in a different kind of environment and operating with the mentality that they're allowed to in the border. It's look, when there have been U.S. wars in urban areas, there's always a recognition of how dangerous this gets and how many mistakes can be made. This is why most presidents are reluctant to do that. And here we have not a war, although some say it is, but we have that exact kind of deployment and those exact kind of tensions unfolding, Michael, in a city. And this is not a surprise. When Stephen Miller announced the whatever 3,000 per day deportation goals, and that is a goal that obviously ICE agents, Border Patrol agents, and other members of DHS are going to take seriously, it naturally meant this was being moved into cities or densely residential areas, even those not in cities. And there were many critics right up front, right away, who said this is going to be dangerous. It's going to, create possibly lethal, deadly encounters, and very violent ones. And it's going to lead to many mistakes, even if you had the best trained forces, which it's clear is not the case at this point. But that is why the structure of the policy and the broader rationale is so important. Just focusing on ICE itself, I think, kind of limits some of what can be done. And Garrett Graff, by the way, who I see now on the subject line, in terms of I didn't see that report, but Graff is really one of the best. He has been writing about ICE and DHS for a while now, and I think he knows more about it. I would add one other part of this, and yes, Don, I think many people feel that having prison camps for people who are not criminals, who have not even been detained really as criminals, and putting them in conditions that these facilities clearly entail is yet another major controversy and scandal, and some would argue human rights issue. unfolding here in the United States. I did want to just say, the conversation has shifted so much toward deportation and border enforcement that the original conversation of the early 2000s, where um, oh, that's a good question, Reba, and I will talk about that. Yes. Um, in the early 2000s was about a deal between tighter borders and a path to citizenship. And gradually, what has happened is that deal was not made. Both President George W. Bush and President Obama, I wrote about this in some books, that Shalestia, right? Both of them tried to craft a deal. They had a bipartisan coalition in the Senate, but House Republicans really, who had shifted to the right by the 90s, killed it. And the path to citizenship since has really fallen off. And what we're talking about almost entirely is what kind of enforcement, how aggressive the enforcement should be, and should we just be talking about the borders, or should we be talking about deportation internally and what the number should be? But it's remarkable from a historical perspective that, the attempted deal by both Bush and Obama in the early 2000s, not that far away, has really moved off the table. I think it's been one of the success of a harder line Republican Party on immigration that, again, I think starts in the 90s in California with Governor Wilson, but intensifies in power in the 20th century, especially after the Tea Party. And the reality is, until that conversation is put on the table, not just a conversation, but a public policy, we will perpetually have this problem. We will perpetually, even if DHS is reorganized, have this approach to what immigration is. And we need a much broader solution. Reba brings up an important point and a fair point that under President Obama, deportation went up dramatically. I think I heard it today in the gym on the daily conversation about this, that talks about just how both effective and pretty ruthless Obama was. Critics called him the deporter in chief. You did hear about it. I do think one difference at the time was that Obama coupled that policy with this effort to reach a grand deal. And not having the two is part of why the conversation in the media seems so different. But there are many critics who say this was part of when it happened, and there's some who argue that Obama was pursuing really an elusive deal at the time because of the way that the Republican Party had shifted by that time. And so what you end up with instead is the current situation. And I think the Democrats have changed as a party in pretty significant ways. And you've seen how Democrats, in part for political fears because of the last election, are moving further and further away from even kind of rhetorical support for immigration as a concept. And so this is going to be a big political haul, but I think, Reba, that's the difference. But that said, we do need to see some of the origins of it's like so much else. President Trump builds on foundations and precedents, and does it in different ways in terms of scale and scope. And he's willing to exploit processes and laws in ways that have not been done, but they do build on precedent. And of course, Obama, there were limits of how much this was happening within the cities, and there was still more cooperation with local enforcement. This is a whole other level in terms, especially in Minneapolis and Chicago and Oregon. It looks like he's backed off on Maine in terms of what you're seeing. Obviously, Obama was also checked at some level because his party in Congress was going to impose guardrails for as much as he did on this issue. And currently, the Republican Party is just giving green lights all the time to the president, even if sometimes saying it has to change. The only significant kind of reversal that we've really seen so far, I think, that wasn't pushed by the courts took place in Maine. And there you have the senator, Republican, under very difficult political situation, a vote that's necessary, a seat that's necessary. So politics is ultimately pretty front and center. Let me take a break with everyone watching and thank subscribers for joining in today. And as always, and I'll get back to that, Don, as always, thank you to the paid subscribers who are allowing this and all the work that goes into it to not only continue, but to, I hope you feel succeed and offer something of value historically in terms of historical knowledge and conversation. So if some of you might consider flipping to a paid subscription, upgrading, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay. Don said election have consequences, and yes, that is true. I mean, I was talking to someone, a scholar, a legal scholar, who was talking about the courts and what the courts can or can't do. But then someone else in this meeting said, ultimately, um, it's politics that will change things. It's party politics. I wrote a book last year on partisanship, and it was a little provocative, but about what parties have done. But I think right now that is kind of the path forward. Will only come from a path toward changing the political status quo only comes from a Democratic Party that can seize power back. It's about elections, and I think the 2024 election, for people who say, as the old saying goes, that the choice is between Tweedledee and Tweedledum, see, that is not necessarily true, and that there are big differences about the candidates who are chosen in elections, and they can have significant policy repercussions, which we are seeing right now on so many levels. And I think for many people, the most both painful and clarifying example is what is happening in Minneapolis, which gets back to the early question. Sometimes it's simply the convergence of different events and obviously tragedies that makes the focus of the media in one area versus another. But it's not a competition. It's again, in the 60s, you saw the media would shift its spotlight from Georgia to Mississippi to other states. And it's about the cumulative exploration that happens at a given moment of anti-democratic forces or flaws and structural problems that exist in the nation. And we are seeing that. So then it leads to the second question, which is what you said, Don, politics. And how does the politics respond? And the midterms, we are now in the midterm year, and it is hard, without exaggerating, to say that historically this is going to be one of the most consequential midterms, both for how it impacts the balance of power, but also, as midterms often do, how it sets up the template for the presidential election. The two are often very related. That often helps determine who's going to run, who's not going to run, helps put certain issues on the agenda. It's a testing ground, like primaries, for the party to see where things stand. And it has effects on all of those levels. And it's obviously, finally, like we're talking about with Minneapolis, it's going to be a few months where both parties, but certainly Democrats as one of the parties, will have an opportunity to really make a forceful case when you have a lot of the electorate, not like a presidential election, but still more than normal, paying attention to politics and making these choices. So on all levels, I think that comment is spot on and gets to the heart of what we're going to be talking about, what we'll be looking at this year. So I realized we spent most of our time today talking about Minneapolis. Other issues on the table, we can come back to that next week. Overseas, for example. Still a lot that is going on. Very interesting comments from Canada, and the idea of classic allies shifting and collectively, essentially creating a defense against the United States is extremely important. And we can talk about that. And I'll say before we close, the Kennedy Center closing for 2 weeks. I don't know exactly what's going on, what the story is, but it is pretty remarkable and hard not to see, or at least think there is a connection between all the boycotts that have been announced and his deciding to close this down for renovations. It's a kind of presidential ownership that I think you see being felt at so many levels, from the East Wing to the Kennedy Center, and this is how far he goes. But again, finally, that some of these are, they're clearly generating backlashes, and I think we can maybe explore that next week, what that looks like. Anyway, thank you, everyone. I have to run. I have students coming in, but thank you for joining office hours. Thank you for your support, and look for my newsletter tomorrow morning and all the conversations to come. Bye bye, everyone.